In this video, I discuss the history of religion and atheism in the USSR. Nearly all information for this video will be based on a book by a historian from Wesleyan University, Victoria Smolkin. It was published by Princeton University in 2018 under the title A Sacred Space is Never Empty, A History of Soviet Atheism. And I want to make it clear that this video is not about promoting a religious or anti-religious worldview. It is about the case study of how the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was changing its mind on what religion and atheism really is. As a result, they had to review their ideas and apply new strategies in their attempt to fight religion. First, they applied one strategy. It didn't work, so they had to apply another one. It didn't help much either. They tried something else. It also didn't really work. Eventually, they decided to give up their atheistic project and invited religion to become its allies. So the struggle of the Soviet Communist Party over how to deal with religion will be the main focus of this video. And please watch until the end if you want to understand why, after many decades of the full frontal fight against religion, the head of the Soviet propaganda and the Ideological Commission of the USSR, one of the top-ranking officials, Lenin, concluded, "You cannot beat religion simply with lectures. In order to squeeze out God, it is first necessary to become truly human. The true atheist is a person who is in his marrow concerned with the fates of those who have become victims of religious ideology, a person who bravely invades a person's life and brings the warmth of his heart to the people, a humanist who is battling for people's souls." But before I switch to statistics and other academic and historical data, let me tell you a bit of my personal story. I was born in the USSR in the early 1980s, before Gorbachev became its head. After the collapse of the USSR, my country got its independence and started working on its new future without depending on Russia and decisions made in Moscow. Being a Soviet boy, I remember going to a beautiful Orthodox church to jump on trampoline and do gymnastics. My dressing room was in the bell tower. Yes, it sounds weird. Another church in my hometown I visited was a museum, and the other served as an art gallery. Yes, it was a norm and reality for thousands of churches even in the late 80s, early 90s. Beautiful cathedrals, mosques and synagogues in the Soviet Union were used as libraries, swimming pools, gyms, warehouses and so on. But suddenly it all changed in the 90s. Churches became real churches. Moreover, I became a witness of unprecedented religious revival when people were flooding places of worship. Not just in big cities, but even in many small villages, you could find Protestant missionaries, often from the US. The land and construction materials were so cheap that they could easily purchase a land and erect a huge church, and people were coming. Many of them had no idea why and where they were going. Some were coming just to see what was going on, or for some material reasons, like getting American second-hand clothes. Yes, it really was something unique after collapse of the Iron Curtain. And many people had joined new churches, or simply started openly visiting the Orthodox churches. New religious movements and alternative spiritualities prospered as well. Thanks to the events in the Soviet region, scholars of religion have an amazing case study when during 70 years the government had all necessary tools and active desire to reduce the presence of religion. They applied government propaganda, administrative restrictions, and invested incredible amount of resources to defeat religion. However, what was the result? And this is what we are going to discuss here. We will focus on a few periods of the Soviet era. I start from the revolution and new governance under Lenin, then we'll discuss what happened to religion under the rule of Stalin, then Khrushchev, Brezhnev, and eventually Gorbachev. So let's start with a short overview, and then we'll return to 1917, and step by step we'll cover each significant milestones. First, I'll discuss a period under Lenin and how his attitude and strategy has changed from ideological to openly aggressive repressions and desire to defeat religion through administrative means. Lenin at first did not see value in atheism as a philosophical position, and we'll discuss why. Then I focus on the rise and fall of the League of Militant Godless under Stalin, why Stalin, after following Lenin's strategy, eventually changed his mind and started recovering religion, but already under his direct control. As a result, Stalin's last decade from 1943 to 1953 was a period of relative stability in church-state relations and even a small religious revival. Next, we'll cover what happened under Khrushchev and how he recovered systematic attacks on religion through atheist propaganda. Under Lenin and Stalin, religion was defined primarily in political terms, and focus was on neutralizing religious institutions. So, what tools were used? Administrative restrictions. They thought that if we close all religious institutions, if we kill or send to labor camps all clergy, then religion inevitably disappears. Therefore, no surprise that they literally believed that in 5 years they will create an atheistic society. But it didn't happen. The party had to redefine the very definition of religion. They realized that administrative restrictions will not create an atheistic society. Religion is not only about religious institutions. There is organized religion, but there is also popular religiosity and superstitious beliefs, and to eradicate them will be much harder. It is a long-term process. Suddenly, things that were not considered religious practices before became the focus of their anti-religious campaign. I'll discuss this important transformation at the end of this video, so please stay with me. During Khrushchev's era, there was an attempt to impose scientific atheism through education. However, the project of intellectual enlightenment failed, and the party, after realizing their mistakes, attempted to win the hearts of the Soviet people through secular rituals and spiritual or positive atheism, focusing already not reason but human emotions. This mostly happened already during the Brezhnev era, when the Institute of Scientific Atheism was launched, and when social sciences provided research tools and collected data from the fields about real levels of religiosity and feedback from below. It demonstrated that the Soviet anti-religious propaganda was not successful. They were hitting in the wrong place. Religion prospered, especially in rural areas and among progressive intellectuals in the cities. And now, after identifying, as they thought, true functions of religion, the party started working on how to expel religion from the Soviet people's life and how to substitute religious functions by similar secular rituals and needs. Religion must disappear not only from the public space but from people's daily lives. And now they needed to transform atheism from a didactic tool that appealed to reason into something positive. Atheism had to answer new kinds of questions, solve new kinds of problems, and reach new kinds of spaces. In other words, atheism itself must become a positive worldview. Anyway, this exposed the limitations of atheistic work and the gap between atheistic theory and practice. As a result, the attempt with militant atheism under Lenin and Stalin did not lead to a victory. Scientific atheism under Khrushchev also showed its limitations, and now the stakes was on positive or spiritual atheism, which appealed to the aesthetic, emotional, and ritual sides of human experience. In my personal opinion, this part of the video will be the most interesting for any scholar or simply a person interested in what religion and what atheism can really mean. Finally, we discuss how eventually the Communist Party was unable to win the hearts of new generations with their atheistic ideology and decided to give up on their atheist project and invite religion back into the public sphere when the Orthodox Church and the government became allies. Basically what we can see even in today's Russia. All this happened already under Gorbachev, and of course at the end we'll focus on the current situation with religion in the post-Soviet republics. I would like to repeat that nearly all information is based on this wonderful book by Victoria Smolkin. Professor Smolkin committed herself to 7 years of research. She spent many days in various archives in Russia and Ukraine, and interviewed people that were directly involved in institutionalized atheist propaganda. As a result, the book is full of astonishing details about Soviet atheism, and I highly recommend it. What I share here are just the basic details from the book. Now, after this short overview, let's get back to the revolution. When Lenin came to power, the Bolsheviks instantly passed a few decrees to establish a secular state. One of them was the Decree on Land. It nationalized all monastic and church land. Before 1917, the church was responsible for the registration of births, marriages, deaths, and divorce. Now the government created a secular bureaucracy and took over this function. Very soon the Bolsheviks removed religion from government and education. Religious organizations lost their status as juridical entities, they were not allowed to own property, and parishes now had to lease church buildings from the state, while the clergy became employees of the parish. But interestingly, Victoria Smolkin writes, if Marx and Lenin wrote little about religion, they wrote even less about atheism, largely because they consider it unimportant to the revolutionary unfolding of history. For both Marx and Lenin, religion had no autonomous power. Since it was part of the superstructure, its existence depended on the economic and political base that nourished it. Without the capitalist foundation and religious institutions that exploited the masses in its service, religion would simply disappear, along with private property, class divisions, the family, and the entire bourgeois capitalist edifice. It basically means that the masses will be able to accept atheism only if the socio-economic roots of the condition that force them to believe in religion are removed. Religion should die out naturally and gradually in the course of the implementation of the ideas of socialism. This way, atheism did not produce communism. Vice versa, atheism was the product of communism. For more on that, see also Joseph Blankholm's article Remembering Marx's Secularism. Joseph Blankholm, similarly to Victoria Smolkin, demonstrates that Marx recognized the emotional need for religion. He believed that religion never warrants a full frontal assault because it is a symptom rather than a cause. So Marx was against violent measures against religion. Why is all this important? Because there is a big possibility that from the start Lenin held a non-violent position towards religion. Like Marx, he advocated against offending religious feelings, since doing so could turn passive believers into active counter-revolutionaries. Yes, Lenin hated religion, but planned to fight it ideologically. There were specific events that led him to change his mind. I won't go into details and just mention that it was more likely related to the famine in 1922 and the opposition Bolsheviks met when they tried to requisition church property by force and met with opposition. Behind this resistance, Lenin saw the work of the clergy, which meant that the church was no longer just a reactionary force, but also an active agent of counter-revolution, and therefore a political actor. As a result, Lenin decided to choose a path of harsh repressions. The clergy were already seen as political enemies that must be neutralized. After Lenin's death in 1924, Stalin adopted a similar approach. In 1939, the Bolsheviks had practically destroyed the church as an institution. All monasteries and seminaries were closed. More than 50,000 churches were closed or destroyed, with only about 100 that still function. Many priests were killed or sent to labor camps. The church went underground. Churches were looted and destroyed, icons were burned publicly, while anti-religious museums were created on the territory of most important monasteries and cathedrals of the country. In 1931, the main cathedral in Moscow of Christ the Savior was blown. In its place, the Bolsheviks planned to construct the Palace of Soviets, a colossal tower topped by an enormous statue of Lenin. The Palace of Soviets was meant to be a testament of the triumph of the new world built on the ruins of the old, a palace for the proletariat in place of the palace of its oppressors. But the war changed plans, and eventually, in 1960, the space was filled with an enormous heated outdoor swimming pool. It functioned up until 1994. Today, however, the cathedral is back, and it is the largest Orthodox cathedral in Russia. By the way, I visited it in 2005, and yes, it is an amazing temple. The period from 1932 to 1937 is called the Godless 5-year plan. The League of the Militant Godless, under the leadership of Yemelian Yaroslavsky, became a very significant force. The membership grew from 700,000 in 29 to 5.5 million in 32. Yaroslavsky also headed the Antireligious committee, and like many communists was convinced that religion as a product of history will soon disappear. The attitude was very optimistic. We just push a bit harder and in 5 years we'll get rid of religion. Such a statement in itself requires no less faith than the religious one. As a result, they were deceived. Religion continued its secret underground life and people continued to secretly baptize their children. If you want to know more details about this period, I recommend to check these books. Things changed during the war when Stalin realized that the Soviet Union would survive the war, and that it would also keep the annexed territories where religion was present significantly. Stalin introduced a new model for managing religious affairs. On September 4, 1943, he called a meeting at his summer residence outside Moscow. At this meeting, Stalin informed NKVD Colonel Georgy Karpov, who had been in charge of counterintelligence operations, that a special organization was being established to manage church-state relations, to be called the Council on the Affairs of the Russian Orthodox Church, and Karpov will be its head. The same evening, Stalin invited to Kremlin Karpov along with Metropolitan Sergei, Metropolitan Alexei, and Nikolai. Stalin informed the church hierarchs that the patriarchate was being restored and that the church could now count on the state's support. After 4 days, on September 8, the Orthodox Church organized a council composed of 19 bishops, 16 of whom had just been released from prison camps. Some were literally taken from the camps by airplane to Moscow, so that at the council they would elect Metropolitan Sergei as the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church. Later, hundreds of bishops and thousands of priests were also released from the labor camps, while new government council under Colonel Karpov began the work of reopening religious spaces and registering religious communities. So, as we see, Stalin now saw orthodoxy as an instrument of foreign policy on the world stage. It also had to do with a significant presence of Lutherans and Catholics in annexed territories. After the war, Stalin was much more concerned not with the spread of atheism, but already with the effective management of religion through the KGB. The party never openly renounced atheism, but to the dismay of ideologically committed atheists, it no longer endowed it with political value or resources. Atheists, such as the League of Militant Godless, understood the signals of the party and faded into the background. As a result, Stalin's last decade, from 1943 to 1953, was a period of relative stability in church-state relations, and even a small religious revival. After the war, the Russian Orthodox Church rebuilt its infrastructure. By 1954, there were 18,609 functional churches, mosques, and synagogues, and more than 18,000 registered clerics in the USSR. Thus, atheism practically disappeared from public life until Khrushchev reopened the door for its return. So now let's switch to Khrushchev era. In popular culture, Khrushchev became famous for two statements: that soon religion would exist only in museums, and that Khrushchev would show the Soviet people the last priest on television. He is also famous for starting the process of de-Stalinization. On February 25, 1956, he sharply accused Stalin in use of terror, violence, and repressions, and presented it as a betrayal of the party's communist ideals. State officials were shocked. Some suffered heart attacks, and some later took their own lives due to those revelations. Cities and strategic objects named after Stalin began to be renamed, and his body was taken out of the mausoleum. Under Khrushchev, there was a transition from looking at religion as a political enemy to viewing it as an ideological opponent. The political leaders and ideologists of the Soviet Union at some point realized that they misunderstood what religious faith really was, and that their optimism was deceptive. Soviet atheism had to renounce its militant origins and became scientific. During this period, the emphasis began to be placed on scientific atheism and enlightenment, but soon they realized that it didn't work either. They pose a question: if we are building communism here, then why, decades after the revolution, is religion still so influential? Therefore, Soviet ideologists were forced to study the psychology of religious people in order to properly organize atheistic education. On July 7, 1954, the Central Committee issued a decree on great insufficiencies in the propagation of scientific atheism and on measures of its improvement. It pointed to the activity of churches and various religious groups. The party started a new aggressive campaign against religion, especially in rural areas. The pressure was put on the media. Journalists and editors were asked to increase propaganda through radio and television. It was necessary to get to people in rural areas. It certainly had an effect, but still not as desired. In the reports sent to the Council of the Affairs of Russian Orthodox Church, the KGB noted that there were even priests who ridiculed the efforts of atheists. Priests were reported to have said that the quality of Soviet atheism was so low that they had nothing to worry about. It even had an opposite effect. In general, the Council concluded that the increase of anti-religious propaganda in the media in fact led to a sudden increase in the demand for religious rights, especially for baptism. The party admitted defeat and retreated. Already in November 10, 1954, a new decree on errors in the conduct of scientific atheist propaganda among the population addressed the fallout of the summer's anti-religious campaign and tried to repair the damage. The party had to admit that their understanding of religion was wrong. It condemned the use of slander, insult, administrative interference in the activities of religious organizations, and so on. The primary message was that in the present historical context, religion was to be addressed with ideological rather than political mechanisms. The report revealed that religious institutions that operated legally were indeed patriotic. It was therefore incorrect to see the clergy and believers as internal enemies. They are citizens whose rights and feelings had to be respected. Therefore, religion was no longer a political enemy to be repressed, but an alien ideology to be eradicated through enlightenment. The battle now was with the belief, not the believer. In 1954, Soviet society was a little confused because of such a duality. Some even suggested a third way that put religion at the service of communism. But after 1957 things changed. Khrushchev was able to defeat his political opponents and now had full power in his hands. In 1958, a new war was declared on religion. New decrees imposed even harsher taxes on church and monasteries. Both the church and the party understood that their success depended on their ability to influence the next generation, so the church was ordered to limit the number of applicants admitted to seminaries and raise the age of entry from 18 to 30. In the time of Khrushchev, 5 out of 8 theological seminaries were closed. The number of operating monasteries, which reached 100 in 1945, was reduced to 18 by the mid-60s. The number of churches and chapels decreased from about 13,000 in 1960 to 7,000 or 8,000 in the mid-60s. In general, everything was done to limit the economic power and social autonomy of the clergy. Priests were forbidden to take part in making any administrative or financial decisions and were put on a monthly salary. Thus, the party wanted to deprive priests of material incentives, because now it doesn't matter how many rites of baptism you perform, the salary will remain the same. In addition to this, citizens of the USSR were required to present their passport data for the rituals. This way the party collected information and could then pass it on to workplace or schools. Also, the pressure was put on school teachers and atheist propaganda in schools. Plus, in the period from 59 to 63, many anti-religious movies were screened. Of course, an anti-religious campaign of this magnitude should have yielded results, but as it turned out, not quite the ones that party had hoped for. Once again, the government had to recognize the flexibility and resilience of religion. It realized that administrative restrictions, again, would not lead to the inevitable extension of faith. This troubling conclusion was brought to the Central Committee in 1964 by the deputy head of the KGB's chief directorate, Fyodor Sherbak, in a secret report titled On Facts of Administrative Measures Against Believers. He basically reported that local authorities closed many churches, prayer houses, and mosques. They fired religious believers from work and expelled students from universities for observing religious rites. Most of these anti-religious measures, he stressed, were illegal and led to undesirable consequences, such as increased religious fanaticism, as well as the growth of unregistered religious groups and their movement underground, where authorities could no longer monitor their activities. He spoke of a few specific cases when in some regions, after officials closed several Baptist prayer houses, the number of pastors and believers had only increased. In addition, Sherbak noted that the repressive anti-religious policy did not achieve any serious atheistic goals, but at the same time attracted negative attention abroad. For more details, please read chapter 2 of the book. Later, in 1966, the Council for Religious Affairs also admitted that the illegal rush closure of churches under Khrushchev had only increased religiosity. Examples were given from Dnipropetrovsk and Vologda regions, and from Moldova, where most of the churches were closed, but in response, the number of riots in the remaining few churches increased significantly compared to all the previous ones taken together. At the same time, in the field of scientific propaganda, they also failed. They realized that science cannot solve the problem with religion. In reality, most people don't care about scientific progress or simply find it hard to see any contradictions between scientific knowledge and religious devotion. As a result, scientific atheism was not able to fill the empty space in Soviet people's soul. Let me give you some details on that. During the Khrushchev period, the space race was never a purely scientific or technological competition, but also ideological. Some famous people were invited to participate in atheistic propaganda, such as the Soviet cosmonaut German Titov, the second person to go to space after Gagarin. Also, planetariums began to be considered the most effective space for atheistic work. The state began to invest a lot of resources in the construction of new planetariums. Those responsible for atheistic propaganda called for the creation of planetariums in every major Soviet city. So in 1973, there were already more than 70 planetariums in the country. By the way, many of them were open in former churches. Thus, the Moscow Planetarium was to become the coordinating center for Soviet atheism. As Victoria Smolkin stated, if cosmonauts were the saints of scientific atheism, then the planetarium was the temple. Anyway, it became a place where hundreds of thousands of people would hear lectures and watch films on scientific atheism, with titles like Why I Broke with Religion or The Atheist Significance of Space Flights. Plus, ideologists of atheism not only invited believers to attend lectures, but also brought the planetarium to believers. They had agitation buses, or mobile planetariums that could organize lectures and exhibits even in rural areas, collective farms, pioneer camps, military complexes, and so on. But atheist lectures have been criticized for relying almost exclusively on the natural sciences and avoiding philosophical issues. People complain that lectures were too dry and boring, or some people simply interpret them in their own way. After listening a lecture about the beauty of cosmos, some shared their impressions by saying, "We like how delightfully God created the universe." This demonstrated that scientific education does not necessarily contain atheistic propaganda, and that atheists need to understand religion and religiosity much deeper. Look at this cartoon. Here the angels take the atheist lecturer to heaven. When he asks, "Why are you lifting me up?" angels answer, "For bad atheist lectures." German Titov also mentioned that cosmonauts were fundamentally unfamiliar with religion and therefore lacked the religious literacy that would give their claims power. He said, "And if by chance I come across some atheist books, then, with rare exception, those books were so boring that unless there was a real necessity, one does not really want to read them." All in all, these and other factors caused Soviet officials to reconsider their belief that science was atheism's most powerful weapon, and that their predictions about the future of religion were real. Plus, they realized that religion is not something static. It always keeps transforming and modernizing. conventional Marxist idea that religion is something atavistic, medieval, or incapable of modernization proved to be wrong. Therefore, it revealed some ideological blind spots of Marxism-Leninism. According to the patterns of development outlined by Marxism-Leninism, religion is supposed to disappear under the pressure of socialistic construction and scientific progress, but it didn't happen. When atheists encountered lived religiosity, they realized that customary explanation for the persistence of religion, for example economic explanations about social inequalities, or political explanations, or the notion that it is the product of ignorance and backwardness, indeed were very superficial. They could not explain the complex spiritual landscape on the ground. Reports from the field demonstrated that people had no problem believing in God, Lenin, and Khrushchev, and it is not rare to find in the home of a believer a prayer book lying next to the program of the Communist Party. Plus, religion's emphasis on the social doctrine undermined communism's claim to be the sole salvation of the weak and oppressed. That is, religion helped to solve real social problems. The believing communities supported each other financially and psychologically. Therefore, believers did not see a contradiction between their religious beliefs and loyalty to the Soviet state. Many of those surveyed consider communism to be the manifestation of Christian ideals. Even some party members did not see the contradiction, like why fight religion at all? Why can't we build a good socialistic state with religion on our side? So there was a confusion. Some lecturers complain that when they tell people that religion is harmful, they are asked to explain why religion is harmful and what exactly is so harmful in it. In such situation, they usually could not give a good, clear answer, but only get off with general information. Anyway, as we see it, the ideological establishment lacked a clear picture of the emotional world of Soviet people. The second ideologist in the USSR after Suslov was Leonid Ilyich, who was Khrushchev's protege and headed the Ideological Commission. So, in 1963, he emphasized that the decrease in the number of churches did not affect the number of rights. In Ukraine, 40% and in Moldova, 47% of children born were baptized. Religiosity remained high in the Baltic. In Lithuania, 68% of births, 50% of marriages, and 70% of funerals were religious. In other regions of the USSR, religious rights increased, and even the intelligentsia and party members often observed religious rituals. So how come? If we look at the big picture, on one hand we have a government with enormous administrative and material resources. For many decades they invest all these resources to systematically combat religion. On the other hand, we have oppressed and humiliated religion, often underground, without any access to media, radio, television, and yet their popularity among people is not just dying out, but even increasing in some regions. So what was wrong? In November 1963, the Ideological Commission met again to discuss atheist work in light of Ilyichov's article on the formation of the scientific worldview in atheist education. In the article, Ilyich argued that atheist propaganda appeals to reason but loses sight of emotions. The clergy and sectarians aim to act not only and not so much on reason as on emotions. We ourselves need to not only understand the meaning of the emotional factor, but to make practical use of it. I remind you, this is opinion of the head of Ideological Commission of the USSR, one of the top-ranking officials. He also stated, you cannot beat religion simply with lectures. In order to squeeze out God, it is first necessary to become truly human. The true atheist is a person who, in his marrow, concerned with the fates of those who have become victims of religious ideology, a person who bravely invades a person's life and brings the warmth of his heart to the people, a humanist who is battling for people's souls. As you may see, it sounds like a serious realization. An ideological commission that he headed since then has focused on everyday's life and the family that became one of the battlegrounds for the Soviet soul. Atheist ideologists were reminded that religion plays a very important function in people's life. It has ability to console them in times of pain and grief. For example, Jared Diamond in his The World Until Yesterday reminds that one reason religion spread and endured was because it encouraged norms of sharing, which were crucial to survival in an environment where there was no social security system. Diamond argues that religion itself has served 7 different functions in the course of human history, and that the importance of given functions vary at different phases of development, from being extremely important to being entirely absent. You can see them on the screen. And Diamond believes that if in the next 30 years the living standards will continue to rise, function 1 and functions 4 through 7 will continue to decline, but functions 2 and 3, diffusing anxiety through ritual and providing comfort about pain and death, will continue to persist. What kind of hint that those functions of religion are really crucial? So, what Soviet atheists supposed to do after realizing it? They were asked to approach the Soviet person as an individual, take an interest in the joys and worries that accompany life, and intervene when help was needed. As Ilyich stated, the battle with religion should be connected with the battle for improving the conditions of people's life. The battle should be conducted in such a way that the believer would see in the atheist a close friend who wishes him good and not evil. So, if they really want to achieve success, it was not enough to place administrative restrictions on religious life or fill Soviet newspaper and lecture halls with enlightenment propaganda. Atheism needed its own clerical caste capable of doing the pastoral work that would bring Soviet people to atheism. This was conclusion. As you may see, the ideologists of atheism eventually realized that it is more effective to fight religion not with the strong hand of power and oppression, and also not with the power of knowledge and science, and not with criticism and ridicule, but with sincere care and love. This is what people really need. The ideologists of atheism realized that religion is not so much a system of views as a system of feelings. One prominent atheist gave an example about the importance of religious emotions. He said that when he visited a Baptist meeting, believers referred to one another as brother and sister, creating the sense of the intimate community, and this was more important than any religious dogma and belief. As one woman at the meeting told him, she really didn't care whether God exists. She would remain religious, since because of religion, life is much easier for her than for atheists. He then added that we cannot forget that one does not cure the sick with the stick, and that man's spiritual world cannot remain unfilled. If we do not fill it, it will be filled by those whose views are foreign to us. A sacred space never remains empty. I hope now you understand why Victoria Smolkin's book is called that way. But what they did to address this realization, how they worked on filling this empty space and with what, I'll discuss in the next video. It will be focused on the work of Institute of Scientific Atheism during Brezhnev era. I'll tell you how the atheist apparatus tried to transform atheism from a didactic tool that appealed to reason into an emotional, spiritual or positive atheism, investing lots of resources in secular rituals. I promise it will be very interesting, so please check if you are subscribed to the channel, click the bell icon to turn on notifications. Also, please like the video, leave a comment below and check out my other videos. Once again, details are in the book and I highly recommend it. The link is below. Thank you.